When you ask people what the most influential game of all time is, one game comes to mind. Not that one. Yep, that's the one. The Legend of Zelda, one of the most iconic video games since the start of the gaming era, influenced many children back in the 80s when it was released, and still does so today, with the multiple installments in the series from as recently as 2017. So today, I'm going to give you a brief history of the Zelda franchise to get you caught up.
Yo, what the heck is this?
Why don't you just go back into the stock folder where you belong? Anyway, let's move along.
Hey, can you just, get out? Please and thank you. So, my editor thought he could make his own content, but that's not allowed. He's only allowed to edit. So, this is my video now. If, nobody minds, I'm just gonna steal this idea and use it as my own now. Thanks. Zelda's inspiration was based off the creator Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood, where he would explore the wilderness of Kyoto and look through caves, creeks, and rivers. According to Miyamoto, one of his most memorable experiences was the discovery of a cave entrance in the middle of the woods, and explored it with only the aid of a lantern. Miyamoto's end goal for the game was to create a miniature garden for the person playing. Princess Zelda was inspired by novelist Zelda Fitzgerald. Miyamoto heard the name and found it pleasant, and decided to name a character after her. And the main character Link had a design based off Peter Pan. His name was based on how the game was originally supposed to be based in the past, present, and future. And he was the link between all of them. But nowadays, Nintendo just throws all that out the window, and he says he's supposed to be the link between the player and him. Yeah, let's stick with that one. Finally, on to the fun part. The first game. In Japan, the game was released on the NES in 1986 and performed very well. But the president of Nintendo America thought the game would not age well in America and said it was too complex and challenging. And because of the text-heavy dialogue, Americans would get bored of reading. The game was released a year later in America and sold over 5 million copies. Now onto the actual game. The original Zelda shares many characteristics that come up in following games, such as the three main characters, Zelda, Link, and Ganon, along with the appearance of the Triforce and the setting of Hyrule. The main plot is that Ganon, the Prince of Evil, takes over a small kingdom named Hyrule and the Triforce of Power. In response, Princess Zelda splits the piece she has, the Triforce of Wisdom, into 8 parts and spreads them between 8 dungeons for a brave warrior to find and restore. But after doing so, she is kidnapped by Ganon, and her maid Impa finds a boy named Link to save Zelda, to restore the Triforce of Wisdom. And to beat the game, Link has to do just that. He fights many enemies and finally gets all the pieces and has to save Zelda from Ganon. The Legend of Zelda was the very first NES game to sell over 1 million copies, and it got stunning reviews for the story and gameplay, with the only problem being the score and graphics. The game has been a staple of RPGs since 1986 because most RPGs have adopted many of the themes from the game, despite the game missing a lot of elements that games today have. In 1987, the sequel game, The Adventure of Link, was released, and unlike the original, having a top-down view, this one was a side-scroller, similar to Super Mario Bros. And finally, they added some RPG elements such as XP points, upgrades, and casting spells. Then, 4 years later, they made the next game, A Link to the Past, which introduced a new mechanic, switching between light and dark versions of the world to defeat Ganon. And a couple of years later, Link's Awakening, and it was all about Link escaping a mysterious island with the name of Koholint. And surprisingly, Zelda nor the Triforce are present in this game. Later the same year, Zelda, the Wand of Gamelon, and Link, the Forces of Evil, were released on the same day, and both were, let's just say, absolute pieces of garbage that never deserved to exist. Enough said. Finally, back to a good Zelda game. Ocarina of Time was released 5 years later as the first 3D Zelda game. It was very ambitious with its design and turned out better looking than most 3D games at the time. 2 years later, we got another 3D Zelda in the form of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, where instead of being in Hyrule, it takes place in a land called Termina, where Link relives the same 3 days over and over again. and the idea was originally hated by the masses, but today it has become a cult classic. Then after those two revolutionary games, we go back to 2D with Zelda Oracle of Seasons / Oracle of Ages. And despite that fact, the games performed very well. It had a new idea of being an overarching story between two different games. The next year, Four Swords was released, being the first Zelda game with a multiplayer option, and also decided to stay 2D. And finally, we are back to 3D with The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, which had a much more cartoony style than the other 3D Zelda games, and will be remembered for how beautiful parts of Hyrule look. Next up, a more experimental game, the Minish Cap, where instead of having Link in a huge world of Hyrule, Link is shrunk down and explores a very tiny area of Hyrule. Next up, a much darker game, the Twilight Princess, where Link is basically a werewolf in a place called the Twilight Realm. After the success of The Wind Waker, Nintendo decided to make the direct sequel Phantom Hourglass on the DS, which added a mechanic of drawing where you would like to go on the touchpad. Nintendo then took advantage of the Wii's motion controls and added realistic sword fighting in their subsequent game, Skyward Sword. A Link Between Worlds is the next game, which is basically a spin-off of A Link to the Past with added mechanic on walking on walls as a painting. Hyrule Warriors is basically the Doom of the Zelda series, where you can battle hundreds of enemies as your favorite characters. And if you're on the 3DS, you can play as the special character Linkle. Triforce Heroes is similar to Four Swords, where there are 3 players all trying to solve puzzles together. And there are lots of cool outfits such as... And last but definitely not least, my personal favorite, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Stunning graphics, an easy to follow story, and has 10 out of 10 reviews from basically every reviewer. If anyone would like to see me post a full playthrough on the channel, if this gets a whopping 20 likes, I might do so. This section isn't going to be as long, but I at least wanted to mention my main man Tingle, a side character who got his own series of games. In Tingle's first game, Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, he gets a job offer from Uncle Rupee to work at Rupee Land, and Uncle Rupee has to lead Tingle through dungeons so he can get enough rupees to throw into a magic spring so it will shoot into Rupee Land. Then, they made another Tingle game, but it was just a rip-off of the original balloon fight for the NES called Tingle's Balloon Fight. In the final game, Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love shows Tingle before he becomes Tingle. He sees an infomercial for a book that makes you popular with women, and of course, my man Tingle needs help in that region. So he orders the book, and when he gets it, he gets sucked into a cartoon world, and his only way out is to dance with the princess of the world. And it's basically a Wizard of Oz ripoff where he has to travel to the princess with Kakashi the Scarecrow, Bariki the Tin Woman, and Lion the Lion. Do not question the logic in any of these games. They're all perfectly sound games. The Zelda games have a huge fan base of hardcore fans who have played every game and probably will as long as Zelda lasts. The game has also made popular cameos in TV shows, ranging from Gravity Falls to How I Met Your Mother. And with more games coming out to this day, new generations will be introduced to the games and will carry on the game's legacy. Zelda will go down in history as one of the most influential games ever.